Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's webinar called the Upad Landlord Clinic. I would like to thank everybody who has submitted questions to us over the last few days. It's much appreciated. Very heavy on the tax front, which I am not surprised about at all, and we'll try and answer as many of those as we can. For those of you who haven't listened to one of our webinars before, the way they work is that you can hear us and you can see the slides on my computer screen, but we can't hear you. So what you can do is use the comments option on the right-hand side of your screen to put any questions to us that you haven't had a chance to do as yet, or anything that you would like to share with us, and we will try and answer any other questions as we can during the next 45 minutes or so. So without any further ado, for those of you who don't know me, I've been a landlord for the last 18 years or so, and it was off the back of that that I wanted to launch Upad, as I got frustrated with traditional channels for finding tenants. I found if I was using a high street agent, I had my own tenancy agreement and I actively wanted to do my own viewings, but I the whole amount, even though I wasn't using all the services. And I just found that the quality of inquiries I was getting from other sites like Gumtree or Classifieds many years ago has sort of fallen to the wayside. So it was off the back of that that we launched Upad a few years ago, and we now operate as the largest online agent in the UK. We've helped 12,000 landlords last year so far. We offer all the services that a traditional high street agent does, but as a la carte menu. So if you just want us to advertise your property, it's £99. If there's anything else you want us to do, you add it into your shopping basket. And the guys are in the office 7 days a week. They're all are accredited to help you as much or as little as you would like. And we've had some really good feedback through sites like Trustpilot on how people have found the experience. What I would like to do, if I may, is do a quick poll on what type of landlord you are. And it's just really helpful for me when we're not physically in a room together, just to know who is in the room, as it were. And so if you could just do this poll for us and just select whichever option best applies to you, and then press the submit button, that would be much appreciated indeed. And we'll just bring up everybody's results once everyone's had a chance to do that. So that's interesting. It's nice just to see we've got a nice blended mix of people in the room, rather than just all sort of brand newbies or really experienced. So I'll try and cover that off within the session. Bear that in mind of who we've got in the room. So I'll just go back to our slides. So in the next 45 minutes, we're going to cover off quite a few questions that have come through from everybody so far. We'll try and answer as many as we possibly can, and then any new ones that have come through as well. So I'm going to actually start off with quite a few and varied tax questions that we've had. I'm not a tax expert. I'm not an accountant. And I just want to sort of say that right up front, so my answers will be accordingly. One of the first questions that we've had through is somebody that is looking to buy a new residential property to live in, and rather than sell their current property, they want to let it out. And one of the questions has been, do I have to pay the higher stamp duty that comes into effect from April onwards this year on the new purchase? And this came through from Stephen. And my feedback on this, and we've spoken to my accountants as well, is actually there's this kind of detail missing within this new increase in stamp duty for people buying a buy-to-let property or a second home. And so situations like this aren't currently covered off about what would happen. But as it stands, is because in effect you are buying a second residential property, you would have to pay the higher stamp duty on that. It may be post tomorrow, when the budget is on and the details of that all come through, that may change. It seems slightly illogical how things are, but again, a lot of the detail of these new policies haven't been sort of documented as yet, and there's nothing to say otherwise. So just bear that in mind if the same situation applies. Another question we've had in also relates to taxation, and I think this is quite common for a lot of landlords that self-manage, and that is if you're doing some of the cleaning or redecoration of your property, can I include my time for doing that instead of employing a cleaning firm or decorator to do the work for you? And the answer to this is that you cannot. You can only include costs for running your property if those costs are from sort of third parties, not your own. And the only exception to this, Carol, who sent this question through to us earlier in the week, is if you actually ran your own cleaning company, for example. There's proper paperwork going through in terms of invoices for the work that you are doing. But if it's just you doing the cleaning at the end of the tenancy and so on, you can't include that within your tax return. And it's important you're aware of that, because if you do, it may be the case in a few years' time, if you get investigated by HMRC, you would have to remove those costs and pay tax that you otherwise wouldn't. So the third question we had through, and I think this is an increasingly common one, is if you're looking to buy a new property to rent out and you're getting a mortgage on it, a buy-to-let mortgage on it, does it make sense to put that property into joint names if you're married, rather than just keep it in your own? And Alice kindly sent this one through to us as well earlier in the week. Now, this is an interesting one, and I think there's a couple of things to bear in mind on this. First of all, if the property is held in joint names in terms of husband and wife, when that property you're doing your tax return on it all, you can spread the costs and the income you've got across both of your tax returns. And as individuals, you have an exemption of what you have to pay tax on. It's approximately 12. Worthwhile to reduce your income tax liability on an annual basis by having it in joint names. The other thing to be aware of is that at the time that you come to sell your property, let's just say it's in 10 years' time, and it's gone from being worth 110 to 110 to 210,000 pounds. That gain of 100k, excluding any costs you are able to deduct, capital costs, that capital appreciation of 100,000, if it's co-owned between the pair of you, you have your own capital gains limit before you pay any tax on it. And again, you will minimise any tax that you have to pay if you're holding it in joint names. But I think the one thing I would say, whilst those are the benefits, is to get a mortgage in joint names requires both of you to be checked. There may be a minimum income threshold that lenders want and so on, and you need to make sure that both of you qualify for that. So if your wife, for example, doesn't work, it may be the case that she's not going to pass the criteria that is needed to get a buy-to-let mortgage. So just be aware of that the quantity of mortgage products you may be entitled to will be reduced if one of you isn't working, for example. But the upside of it is on an income tax perspective annually, and on the capital gains there will be less liability to pay as and when you come to sell your property. So I hope that's answered your question. And then we've had quite a few other sort of questions and thoughts that have sort of come in about the various tax changes that George Osborne has been putting through. He's clearly not on my Christmas card list at the moment. And you know, one of the key ones that I think affects us is not the stamp duty changes that where there's a higher stamp duty to pay on buy-to-let properties that you're buying, and also second homes, but more on the mortgage interest relief that will come into play from next tax year onwards. And I'm not going to go through how it works now, but it's done in a taper way. So the full effect will take 4 years to take into effect. So it's a gradual process that it will be coming in, and you are taxed on your mortgage interest payment. So if you have a highly geared property, a high loan to value, you're going to have a higher tax bill compared to today. We have a calculator that is on the Upad site. If you go to our blog within our landlord zone, you'll be and search for it. What you'll be able to do is put in your mortgage amount, what interest rate you pay, and what tax band you fall into, and it will calculate for you your additional tax compared to today for each of the 4 years that this comes into play. But what I wanted to just put out there is, rather than increase costs, what will actually be the effect of this? And the government has said, when they introduce this legislation, that it will affect 1 in 5 landlords in the UK. Now, there's a couple of million landlords that operate generally in their spare time. Each landlord owns is, and there's generally sort of just under 2 tenants in each property at the moment. And my concern is actually it's going to be that will be affected by these tax changes, something like 30% of all tenants, because I believe a lot of these costs that we're going to have to pay compared to today will be borne by tenants. And I've put this flowchart together that hopefully sort of explains that. Now, I'm just going to sort of walk through the screen, as it were, and just bring this in gradually. But the first bit is, the first 2 key bits is there's going to be higher interest rates whether that's next year or whenever it comes into play, but there will be higher interest rates, so our mortgages will be costing us more. Our tax bills will increase, mainly because of this mortgage interest relief, and I think there will be some of us that sell our properties because they are just unprofitable on an annual basis, and we decide to sell up, which will mean there are less rental properties in the market and arguably more properties for sale. And you would have thought that's a good thing for tenants, because there's a real shortage of housing stock to buy, and a lot of people can't get on the housing ladder. But I think that the type of properties that will be sold, those with a high loan to value mortgage on them, and generally in sort of London and South East, where yields are a lot lower, are not the type of properties that tenants are looking to buy as a first-time buyer property. And given we're still not seeing a significant increase in home, there's a bit of a mismatch here, that there will be some more properties coming on the market to purchase, but they're the wrong type for first-time buyers. And what that means is there's actually less rentals, the same amount of tenants, and in fact more, because there's a growing quantity of tenants out there, and just straight sort of economics in terms of supply and demand, we will see rents going up over the next 5 years as these tax changes and interest rates start increasing and taking effect on us as landlords. Now, the other thing to bear in mind is, for those landlords that don't sell up and stick with it, those costs that we will be bearing will be borne, I think, by tenants. I think we will be passing those costs on. And my 2 examples are if the price of oil around the world increases, price of petrol at the pump also does so, passed on to the consumer, and the same is the case in this environment. And we've actually already seen that in Scotland, where sort of in the last 18 months, agents were banned from charging tenants admin fees, and those costs were then passed on to the landlord rather than agents not charging them, and subsequently passed on to higher rent. And what we saw last year is rents in Scotland increasing by around 9%, and yet the UK average was around 2%. And so you've got sort of 2 examples, I guess, one within our marketplace and one outside of it, where when the cost of raw materials, whether it's gas or mortgage debt, increases, that cost will be passed on to tenants, and why I think something like 30% of all tenants will end with higher rents to pay over the next 5 years. But the issue, I think, really for us is not about whether it's economically viable just to be a landlord. I don't think that's the case, because I see us charging more for letting out properties, but I see rent arrears increasing quite dramatically. And where I come from on that, tenants at the moment are spending around 30% of their take-home pay on rent, and I see that increase into 40 or maybe above 40% of their take-home pay over the next 5 years, partly because we're passing their costs on to tenants through higher rents. There is a mismatch in terms of the amount of housing stock for people to rent and the amount of tenants, and that imbalancement will drive rents up further. And thirdly, there is an aspirational nature to tenants, that when you're living in a property for a year or two, your next property you're going to live in, it's very common that you are renting a property that is more expensive than where you were before. You want a bigger property or a better location, which ultimately is going to cost more. And I think we as landlords need to be aware of those three factors, and I do see it driving up rent arrears over the next few years. And I think it's very important when you're doing your viewings and before deciding on who's moving into your property, of whether they can actually afford it or not. You know, what is the proportion of their take-home pay that is going on rent? Is it something that they can sustain, or arguably are they living outside of their means? And I think that's really important for us as landlords over the next 5 years to be made aware of. And I hope that sort of answered quite a few questions we've had about what do we think about these tax changes. I think the amount of landlords that do sell up will be in the minority. I don't want to put a figure on what percentage, but I don't think it's going to be the 500,000 properties that various online surveys have said. I think it'll be significantly less than that. I think it will be the majority of us that carry on being a landlord. After all, it's a long-term business. And we have capital gains as well. But I think we need to be aware of the consequences of higher rents and what it means for us as a business. So hopefully that's answered a few questions that we've had through. I'm just looking at a few questions that have actually just come in while we've started talking. One question has just been about what percentage should we look to rents annually. And also something about wear and tear. So on the first question about what we should increase rents by, I think there's two things to mention on this. The first is rents are currently rising at about 2.5% annually, and yet take-home pay, people's salaries, has been pretty much stagnant for the last few years. And therefore, we just need to be aware, and it goes back to the slide you can see on your screen, that I see arrears increasing because everything being equal, rents are increasing at a faster rate to people's salaries. You take all these other factors into account and it will emphasise that even further. How much more you should charge, I think, is understanding your marketplace. On various other webinars that we do, we talk about creating an alert on Rightmove or Zoopla. And you do a search for your postcode, number of bedrooms and so on. And there's a button there to create an alert. And you put your email address in, and it will send emails into your inbox that are similar properties in your locality, and it will give you a good steer about how much other properties are being advertised for, and it will give you an indication of what rent increases you could look at. What I would say is I would much rather have a tenant that's paying me 90% of the market rate and paying on time and looking after the property than trying to achieve the maximum rent I possibly could, and it may take longer to find somebody willing to pay that amount, and also they may not be a good tenant in terms of always paying on time. So hopefully that's helped there. And while we're on the taxation bit, as far as wear and tear allowance, what used to be the case, and still is for another 2 weeks, is you could either choose to do the 10% wear and tear allowance. And what I mean by that is if your annual rent was £10,000 per annum, you could offset your tax liability by £1,000, by 10% of your annual rent. And the other way is to charge based on actual replacement of furniture and so on and so forth. Now that 10% rule is what is stopping from the end of this current tax year. But the good news, given that regardless of actually how furnished your property actually is what you are allowed to claim for wear and tear will be changing, and should you be changing a bathroom suite or a kitchen, things like that that you previously couldn't include under wear and tear, you now can. So hopefully that summarises what's happening with wear and tear. There's actually more information on our website if you Google wear and tear within our website, and it will tell you more about it all. But that answer that. And finally, I think there's one other question we've just had on taxation whilst we're on this issue. If you moved into your rental property for a couple of years, you wouldn't have to pay capital gain. What are the rules now? Well, there is this bit. If you've owned a property for 10 years and you've lived in it for a period of time of those 10, let's just say 4, the capital appreciation you've had, and therefore what capital gains tax you have to pay on that, is in proportion. Now, I'm not aware of anything changing as far as that's concerned, but I would recommend speaking to a tax accountant to get definitive rules on it. But if you have lived in a property for a period of the time that you've owned it, you won't have to pay capital gains on the whole lot. So hopefully that helps there. So moving on away from taxation and just a few other areas that we've had quite a few questions on, and we've actually about Section 21s, and these obviously relate to at the end of a fixed term. So if you've got a 12-month AST, if you want the property back at the end of that because either you just want new tenants in there, you want to sell it empty of tenants, or you've got a family member moving in there. For example, you issue a Section 21, which must be done at no less than 2 months before the end of the fixed term. And should there be rent arrears, that's when you issue a Section 8, just so that you are aware. One of the questions we've had is, if I've served a Section 21, can I go to the court at any future date after those 2 months, or is it literally a sort of 2-month period? Well, you can only go to court if you've issued a Section 21, which has to have been at least 2 months before the end of the fixed term. It can be more than that. And there's a 6-month grace period. So you can, if they haven't moved out, you have up to 6 months in order to go to court to get an eviction if you choose to do that. What I would also say is, and probably more importantly, is that from last month there were changes to Section 21. And this covered, this is a webinar in itself, this covered when you could issue a Section 21, what you needed to serve, documentation changed, and also there was other documentation you needed to serve with it, including things like the government right to rent booklet. The new Section 21 means that we can no longer issue a Section 21 at the time that a tenancy agreement starts, which used to be the case. You have to wait at least 4 months, and this goes back to the back end of last year, it's of October. You have to wait at least 4 months for any new tenancies that have started since the end of October before you can issue a Section 21 notice. What goes with it? The government's right to rent booklet, and also the content of that Section 21 has also changed. And again, we've got more information on our website about it all, but just as a quick overview, there has been quite a substantial change to Section 21s, and I think it's worthwhile reading them. We've had a question that's just come in about issuing Section 8s or 21s. What else can a landlord do prior to issuing these notices to persuade tenants to pay any rent arrears they've got? Now, I'll actually come on to that in a second anyway, because one of the other questions we've had is, I can't remember who this one came through from, but there's a turnaround time from going to the courts to sort of getting a court hearing of sort of 6 weeks or so. Now, I've actually been aware of it being longer in my years as a landlord, where it's actually taken a lot longer than that. Is there anything that can be done to speed this up? Now, firstly, wherever your property is, whether that is in the borough of Brent or Westminster or wherever it may be, is that you have to go to the court within that borough to process this application. You can't go somewhere else. The way that you can fast track it. But what I do want to focus on is, and it actually answers this question that's just come in about what should we do during Section 8 or 21, is just be aware that it takes an awfully long time to evict a tenant. And I've put a chart together which just runs through a rough time frame from when you issue a Section 21 to when you get your empty property back. Part of this, but to start with, you can only issue a Section 21 2 months before the end of the fixed term. If it's to do with rent arrears and you issue a Section 8, you have to wait for at least 2 rent payments to have been missed, i.e. a month and a day, before you can issue your tenants with a Section 8. And the timeframes are very similar as far as that's concerned. But what you can see on here is that it takes several months from start to finish before you get your property back. And these are estimates. Sometimes it'll be quicker, sometimes it'll be longer. But these are estimates. And the reason I've put this up here is, one is so that we landlords are aware of the steps involved should we want to do the legal action of evicting our tenants. And what I think this highlights is we should think twice before issuing a Section 8 or Section 20, just because we can. And I think trying to reach an amicable solution, let's just say there's 3 months left on a tenancy agreement, I'm a big fan of trying to reach an amicable solution rather than saying I'm going to issue a Section 8, for example, because they can stop paying you the rent because they're cheesed off with you at the beginning of this process. They can stop damaging the property, and I would much rather reach an amicable solution where maybe if all they can afford is 80% of the rent, great. If they're a few days late every month, that's not the end of the world. And just make a pragmatic, non-emotional decision before you decide to go down this process, because the time you issue a Section 21 or Section 8, your relationship with your tenants is going to change. It's a bit like getting divorced. The second you start speaking to solicitors and paperwork forwards, the relationship changes. It does always go sour. I've never knowingly been aware of it doing anything different. So just be aware, and issuing an amicable solution for me is really important, because the amount of claims for rent arrears has been increasing quite dramatically, and as I mentioned earlier, I see that growing further. It's gone from 70,000 claims in the whole of 2013 to this time last year 42. I haven't got the most up-to-date figures because they do take a while to come through. So there's a growth of increase of rent arrears. Most of us have had arrears in the last 12 months. As I mentioned earlier, people's take-home pay not increasing at the same rate that rentals are. We've also got tenants that are increasingly got. This is Ubers and Spotify's and hire purchase for cars and so on. People's commitments are increasing at the same time. And I think, just to summarise on this point, is before you issue a Section 8 or 21, look at the warning signs. Keep on top of your tenants. If they're a couple of days late, make them aware of the fact. Don't scare them and say, I'm going to issue a Section 8 if you do this again. Make sure you have good communication, and if you haven't, you should be aware that actually maybe this is going sour. If they are not giving you access to the property, and these are just warning signs that I think you might need to consider issuing legal paperwork. People start complaining a lot, or one of the tenants has moved out. It's important, I think, to be aware of these things rather than just assuming you can issue a Section 821 and the world will be fine. It doesn't work like that. It's quite a long and fairly expensive process. Just whilst we're on this issue, one of the other questions that's just on this is somebody who's got a tenant with a CCJ who's absconded a few years ago and have been unable to trace them. What else can they do? Now, there is several tracing businesses out there. There's a couple I'm aware of and have used in the past. Generally, the more information you have got on somebody, the more helpful. So the idea of taking copies of passports, bank statements, driving license is really helpful at the start of a tenancy, because the more you have in terms of their passport number, driving license, national insurance number, mobile phone number, the more of a footprint a tracing agency has in terms of finding them. That said, the more somebody's moved overseas, the more it's going to be trickier to find them. And the other thing just to be aware of mind is that if you do want to trace somebody, and your best bet is just to Google it, because there's a few companies that offer sort of no money, no fee, no win, no fee operations. But just be aware that it can take a few months for that tenant to reappear somewhere else. So what I mean by that is a new address and so on. So once they've absconded, it may be worth waiting 3 to 6 months before their new footprint of where they reside appears online, and then a tracing agency can find them. So just be aware of that. The next area that we've had quite a few questions on also is to do with the right to rent that has been talked about as a pilot in the Birmingham area last year and has been rolled out nationally. And there's a lot of greyness to do with what documentations we need when we are letting a property from today onwards, and ultimately what this is all about is the fact that the Home Office has put responsibility on landlords to ensure that the person who's letting the property has permission to be in the UK. And these right to rent checks mean that if somebody is a British citizen or an EEA national or Swiss national, they're absolutely allowed to be here. That's fine, and a passport that supports that in terms of ID is absolutely fine. But should somebody not have a passport or not be any of those nationals, we probably need to do more due diligence to make sure they're allowed to be in here. And the onus does fall on us as landlords to do these checks on behalf of the Home Office. If you are letting a property from today onwards, we need to do these checks. You need to get copies of ID, and that might be a passport or a driving license, for example, that confirms whether this person is allowed to be in the UK or not. If you have any questions or queries, your best bet is this link on the government website, which is a you sort of go through a journey of selecting various options, and it will tell you whether the person that is looking to let your property, whether they are allowed to or what checks you to do. But ultimately, we need to take copies of their ID and to follow these steps to ensure they are allowed to be in the UK. And there are still quite a lot of areas of concern on this, and in particular, it's you've got to see the original documentation, their original passport, for example. You need to make a copy of it, and one of the things the Home Office said is it can't be a digital copy, i.e. you can't photograph with that passport. Arguably that could be doctored because it's digital, so you need to take a photocopy on a traditional photocopier rather than your phone, for example. And arguably that could be doctored, but that's one of the things that the Home Office have said. So there's still quite a lot of grains on this. Whilst you need to see the original documentation, you don't need to meet the tenants face to face. You can actually do that online in terms of FaceTime or Skype, for example. You have to see the original documentation and take a copy of it through a non-digital means. And the only time there is an exemption on this is existing tenancy. So if you've got 3 tenants on an AST and either there's a renewal of that or it's gone periodic, as long as it's the same people and there hasn't been a break of 3 months, for example, between the tenancy finishing and the second one starting, you don't need to go through these checks. But that web link I've put up there is probably the most useful place to check out to make sure you're being compliant. It does fall on us to do these checks, and it's very important that we do because I think there's quite substantial fines that we can get. I think we've got time for a couple more questions to sort of keep to time on this. Carbon monoxide, somebody was asking about how many do you need and where they need to be located. Now, different rules for England and for Scotland, so I'll do England first. So from October last year, we were required to have a smoke alarm in one per story in every property. So if it's a 2-story property, 1 on each story. The location doesn't matter, although in the hallway corridor makes the most sense, and it doesn't matter whether it's hardwired or battery. And we need to fit a carbon monoxide in any room where there is a solid fuel appliance. I recommend, and what is suggested, is that if you have a solid floor appliance, to fit carbon monoxide approximately 1.5 meters from wherever that appliance actually is. This is absolute black and white. It's absolutely imperative that the time of tenancy starts, that there is a working smoke alarm and you have a carbon monoxide detector in there, and there's a big penalty for not doing so. What I would also recommend is that you have a log that you have checked that there is a working smoke alarm at the start of the tenancy. There's a paperwork trail. Either you've had an electrician check that it works for you and has given you a piece of paper to that effect, so that should there ever be an issue, a piece of paper that says somebody has checked and confirms that there is a working smoke alarm and carbon monoxide in each property, should there be an issue and the tenants haven't put new batteries in, for argument's sake. In Scotland it's slightly different, so the rules are slightly more stringent there. So all landings in terms of circulation rooms, those rooms that are used frequently, and in kitchens you've got to have a smoke alarm. But you've also got to have a CO detector, carbon dioxide detector, in every room housing a solid fuel, any fuel burning appliance. So it doesn't need, it's not so much about whether it's solid fuel, it's any fuel. So it's a bit of a stronger viewpoint there. So do bear that in mind. This is quite a common question. We actually had this quite a lot, where tenants have refused to give access to an engineer to come and do a gas certificate or CP12. What do I do? Now, it comes down to that. If they're not giving you access, firstly, there should be an alarm bell going off in your mind about, is this a good tenant or not? But outside of that, keep a log of the emails or letters that you've written to say somebody's coming around next week to do a gas cert, and confirmation that they've said not giving them access for whatever reason it may be, so that you can prove beyond doubt to a third party, if there ever was an issue, that you have tried several occasions to get a gas certificate done to be compliant, and obviously they're due annually, that your tenant has refused. And as long as you can prove that there is a log, that's really, really important. So it's not the end of the world if they're not giving you permission, although it's an alarm bell from my perspective, but just make sure you have a log to confirm to a third party, if it ever occurred, that you've done your best. Another question we've had, and it is quite common actually, is tenants have been in the property but they've left without giving notice. Can I use any of the deposit to cover some of the rent? Definitely yes, that's part of the reason why you have a deposit. Clearly if you've got either rent guarantee insurance, you can that route to reclaim additional monies for breach of contract, as well as going to small claims court as well. And on this other issue about tenants leaving belongings behind, how long do you have to hold on to them? First and foremost, I recommend you communicate with your tenants where possible to say, look, you've left this, this and this, do you want it, or are you going to, do you not want it, and try and get an answer on that. If you're unable to get any information back from them, I recommend, well, the guidelines are that you've got to hold on to those items for 90 days and then you're allowed to dispose of them. But just try and do everything you can prior to then, because obviously it's a hassle, to get an answer from them about whether they do or do not want to keep it, so you don't have to waste on housing, spare tellies and what have you. And we've got two more, I think we've got time for two more questions, I think, and then we'll draw a close. Is it better to left unfurnished, given the changes to wear and tear allowance, or furnished? Now, this is an interesting one, and ultimately it depends on the marketplace that you operate in. Who are your tenants? Are they families that have belongings, or is it young professionals that only have clothes and electronic devices but not white goods, sofas and so on and so forth? So first of all, understand the marketplace that you operate in. The other thing I'm going to mention is I recommend doing fully furnished for the majority of tenants out there, because we did a test a couple of months ago where this was actually a property of mine. We advertised it completely unfurnished, we just renovated it, and completely furnished, towels in the bathroom, dining room table laid, etc. 4 times more inquiries from the top photograph compared to the bottom one. So what this says to me is I'm going to be able to let my property faster if it's let furnished because it looks more appealing when tenants are looking online. Secondly, I can charge somewhere between 10 and 30% more rent for fully furnished compared to unfurnished. And thirdly, what we've found is that when tenants see the fully furnished property, it's just a brilliant, I can take it, I don't have to buy IKEA for the next 3 Saturdays. And therefore it's far more appealing. So it's something to consider, but just be aware of the marketplace that you operate in. And there was actually a round table event I was part of for Property Week a couple of weeks ago now. And whilst I think this is a very long link, if you go to the Property Week website and in the search box on the top right hand side just type in Upad, it will bring up the discussion, but there's quite a lot of useful things that were talked about there about whether you should or should not furnish a property, and it's probably worth having a look at. So don't worry about writing down that web link now. It's probably easier just to go to Property Week and on the right hand side use the search box for Upad, and it will bring up the article in question, which will give you a bit more of an insight there. So hopefully that's useful. And then I suppose just one sort of final question. You know, where do I see buy-to-let going and demand for rental properties? What I think I might have done during the course of the last 45 minutes or so is sort of highlight the fact that I don't see taxation changes affecting landlords in terms of should I or should I not be a landlord. I think those costs we pass on to landlords. I think we need to be more professional in how we operate. Should we fully furnish or not? What rent should I charge rather than the maximum? What's a good rent that's just going to get it let speedily? And be aware of things like that. I think there will be more and more tenants out there, but I think there's more choice. And ultimately, when tenants are looking for the next rental on the Rightmove app, Zoopla app, which is what the majority of tenants are doing, how your property looks on those sites in terms of really good images, that the agent you're using has a local number, so it's included in mobile minutes rather than 0845, is really important. Make sure you put in your adverts that you're doing the viewings, because 9 out of 10 tenants would rather meet you on a viewing rather than an agent. I think come along to webinars like this and seminars that we do, because that's the way we are all going to be able to learn more about being a landlord and doing. So bear those things in mind. I've added a few guides that you can download. I'll leave this screen up here, but on the download button on the right-hand side of your screen, you can download these 5 charts that we've put together that cover off sort of most of the key things we've been talking about this evening. So it'd be worthwhile clicking a link on them. Whilst I just leave that up there, I'd just like to say thank you very much indeed for everybody for tuning in this evening. I hope you found the last 45 minutes worthwhile and useful, and that there's some things you've learned and can put into your business going forward. You'll be getting more from us shortly, where there's a feedback option. So I'd really appreciate any feedback you give, you know, other areas we can cover off, whether I can improve webinars by different slides, talking slower, faster, better timed to do them, all that type of thing. Really, really do appreciate any feedback you can give us to improve what we're doing, because we do get really good feedback from them, but I'm always keen to find ways of making them even better. You will get a copy of this webinar as well, so you can, if you came in late, for example, you'll be able to listen again, and we will be sending that link out shortly. So if you do want to listen again, or you miss some of it, you can do so. And I suppose that just leaves me to say thank you very much indeed for taking the trouble of listening this evening, and you found it worthwhile. My name is James Davis from Upad, and I wish you a very pleasant evening. All the very best, and take care. Bye.